Good morning, History 259. It's been 2 weeks, so I hope you've been well. I'm feeling better, thank you. Last week was a little rough, but I think we've recovered. So the first and most important thing to talk about for this week, this is our second to last video lecture of the semester, is to talk about the emails that I sent you last week about the course grade, just to clarify a few things. So I wasn't feeling great when I sent them, so I just want to tell you now verbally what the deal is. And the deal is this. Just given the fact that we're all dealing with a lot, I've heard from some of you and their family members who aren't feeling well, etc. Our lives are disrupted. What I've decided to do is to give the grade of A to any of you, to all of you, hopefully, who have been participating in the class since we went online, as just a sort of gesture recognizing the work that you put in these very difficult coffee time circumstances. So as long as you've been participating, you've been completing assignments up until this point, you'll get an A. The assignments for the rest of the semester are going to be this. I'm canceling the final paper because of last week's disruption and because this is just an incredibly stressful time, and I don't think that I'd rather us focus on our physical and mental health than to worry about a 5-page paper. So there's no paper. The only assignments that are left for the rest of the semester are to watch the video lectures, and you're watching this one today, and then to finish completing each week's discussion board response. So if you pull up the amended course syllabus I sent way back in March, when all of this started, you'll see that for last week, because I was not feeling well, we would have talked about parties and the age of revolutions. That's week 14. So that's what I want to talk about today. And so I'm going to talk about the partisanship, political partisanship in the early republic after the creation and ratification of the Constitution. And next week, week 15, or this week, which is week 15, the subject is the early republic, women and legacies. That'll be the topic for next week, week 16. So basically what I'm doing is pushing everything back 1 week. So this week on Wednesday, I'll post a discussion board prompt, and I want you to respond to that. Next week, week 16, I'll record a lecture and post a discussion board prompt on the early republic, women and legacies. And you'll have to respond to that next week, and then that'll be the last thing that we have to do. So you can forget about the final paper, okay? And as long as you, again, continue to watch these last 2 videos and do the discussion board prompts, you'll get an A. And so that's the deal. Of course, email me if you have any questions about that. And I've heard from most of you asking you to respond to my emails. So thank you for responding to me. And so that is what we're doing for this semester, and it's almost over. It's now May the 4th. For today's topic, which was last week's topic, but we're picking it up this week, parties and the age of revolutions. This corresponds to the reading in Alan Taylor, chapter called Partisans, which is chapter 11. So what I'm going to do is just build on a couple of themes that I think are most important. And I'll refer to some pages in Alan Taylor, American Revolutions, chapter 11, Partisans. So if you have that handy, just go ahead and bring it out if you want to read along to some of the pages that I refer to. But the starting point for this is the ratification of the Constitution. So the last video lecture I made, which was 2 weeks ago, week 13, as you know, it was discussion of the Constitution. And the ratification of the Constitution was a surprisingly contentious process, and from it grew the seeds of the first party system, as it's referred to by historians and political scientists. Another way of stating is that the first 2 political parties in United States history emerged because of the ratification debates. This is discussed, by the way, the ratification debates at the end of chapter 10 of Alan Taylor, American Revolution. So I'll talk about them just very quickly, but not in great detail. But The seeds for this first party system grew out of a conflict between so-called Federalists in the ratification debate, people who supported the Constitution, people who supported the Constitution's creation of a strong national government, and anti-Federalists, people who opposed the Constitution on several grounds. Anti-Federalists, some primarily believe that the Constitution was dangerous because it proposed to create a government that would have extensive powers similar to those of the British Empire, British imperial government. And the fear was that it would too grow into it being the national government proposed in the Constitution, would too grow into a tyrannical government hostile to the liberties of American citizens. And speaking of the liberties of American citizens, another point made by anti-federalists is that under the Constitution's initial provisions, there was no and is no explicit list of rights, liberties, as they would have been called at the time, that American citizens held that the national government cannot infringe upon. There's not a specific enumeration listing of what rights individual American citizens have. And they felt that that was necessary to be, they felt it was necessary for those to be explicitly stated so that, again, liberties of individuals could be safeguarded. So in effect, what they being the anti-federalists, wanted was a Bill of Rights. And as I'll talk about just briefly, but it's also discussed in the first parts of Alan Taylor's chapter called Partisans. This led to the creation of the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, passed in 1791, which again enumerate rights that citizens have that the national government cannot violate, cannot infringe upon. Some of them are more well-known than others today. Certainly, I think the First and Second Amendments are the most well-known and the most, in many ways, irrelevant to us. The First Amendment providing freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition, freedom of religion. The Second Amendment, so-called amendment protecting the right to bear arms, obviously, that's an amendment that is very relevant to today because of ongoing gun violence. I don't want to dwell on that too much, but the Bill of Rights and indeed the entire slate of activities of the first Congress, which met beginning in 1789 in New York, again dating back to the ratification debates and conflicts between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, beginning with the first Congress after ratification, quickly snowballed into the first party system, or the growth of rapid growth of intense partisanship, meaning political conflict between political parties that oppose each other on all levels of government policy. And that's, for Alan Taylor in Chapter 11, the main theme of the decade of 1790s. It's, for all historians of this period, the main theme. The fact that very rapidly political parties, one calling themselves Federalists, reaching back to, again, the Federalist camp of supporters of the Constitution's ratification, the other growing out of the Anti-Federalist group who adopted the name by the middle of the 1790s of the Democratic Republicans, the first two political parties that emerged in the United States, is the dominant theme. And partisanship we see touch on all facets of American life during the 1790s, two of which I'll talk about in most detail. They touched on economic policy, and that's definitely true of the creation of the nation's banking system, something that was spearheaded by Alexander Hamilton. Touched on foreign relations. Certainly that was true of the American response to the French Revolution, also to the Haitian Revolution. It touched on questions about westward expansion, a major theme of Chapter 11 of Alan Taylor's American Revolutions. Touched on, to pick up other examples, the relationship between the national and state courts, the court system of the United States, on almost every sphere, I should say, of life that the national government interacted with American citizens, partisanship was a defining feature. And you're probably wondering, or you may be thinking about today when you think of the conflict between political parties, and it's definitely true to say that the seeds for seemingly permanent conflict were planted in the early republic, and that they continue to persist today. And you're going to see some parallels that I'll point out that continue to exist today. Again, the origins of a liberal viewpoint and a conservative viewpoint, for example, that resonate today. But this first party system, the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans, was unique for a couple of reasons and very different from today. Before I get into specific issues, most importantly, economic policy and foreign relations. And the first is that both of these parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, were political parties that primarily and almost entirely, with few exceptions, appealed to white men. Okay, so that's the big difference between then and now. The electorate, the people who held full political and civil rights, was much more limited than is the case today. So when we look at the leadership of the first two parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, we see some differences. We see that Federalists, on the one hand, tended to be more elitist. Certainly that's true of Alexander Hamilton and other Federalists like John Adams, just to name two famous figures. They tended to privilege the interests, privilege the interests of Northeastern financial and mercantile elites, especially those living in urban centers. So, for example, New York, Philadelphia, Boston. Although you find Federalists in the southern states who are also attracted to the Federalists because of their elitist, anti-democratic orientation. Federalists, and this is most prominently true of Alexander Hamilton, were wary of poor, uneducated classes, poor, uneducated white men in particular. And certainly in the South, Federalists were wary of people of color, enslaved or free. That was also true of the Democratic Republicans, who I'll get to in a second. Federalists, moreover, and this is spelled out quite clearly and is one of the standard facts about the Federalists, viewed the United States in economic terms as a nation that should pattern itself, ironically, after the British Empire. Ironic, of course, because of the fact that the United States had gained its independence fairly recently from the British Empire within the previous decade. Yet Alexander Hamilton in particular, in his financial program, his financial plan for the United States, was very clear that the country should be oriented on a British model. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Culturally, Federalists were often paranoid, I think is the best way to put it, because they tended to fear that even middle class, but especially lower class involvement in politics would lead to the nation being politically and socially undermined, because they believe that political life and high-level economic activity should really only be the provenance or the privilege is the better word of the upper elite classes. Having said that, one thing to note about Federalists is that in some northern states, and this is true promiscuously of New York State, in northern states where free men of color, free African American men could vote, interestingly enough, they tended to vote for Federalists. And you might be wondering why. It seems ironic. And it is. The answer is that Federalists, even if they were elitists, even if they were often discriminatory against poorer and more uneducated classes, it tended to be, at least in a philosophical, abstract sense, more anti-slavery. Why? And this is a phrase that Alexander Hamilton, that Alan Taylor uses in chapter 11 of American Revolutions. They tended to view themselves as enlightened figures, and therefore tended to view slavery as at least morally and philosophically wrong. Because they were elitists, they tended to view themselves as paternalistic figures. And those Federalists with anti-slavery beliefs tended to view themselves as a paternalistic protector of enslaved people, meaning that slavery is wrong and slaves should be unleashed from the bondage of enslavement, not so that they could themselves become elites, but so that white elites could in part control them. So it wasn't always a Federalist anti-slavery that we would consider to be morally pure. Yet it should be pointed out that in, again, some areas of the northern states, this is true of New York, and it's true of Pennsylvania, and it's true of Massachusetts, 3 northern states, where men of color could vote, they almost always voted Federalists. So the Federalists there were contrasted by an emergent party in the 1790s that came to call themselves Democratic Republicans, and you see this term throughout the chapter 11. And it's confusing in part because the 2 major parties today are called the Democrats and the Republicans. To be very clear, neither party that exists today has any connection with the Democratic Republicans of the 1790s. Those parties were founded much later in today's parties were founded much later in American history. So this party, which, as I said, sort of grew out of the anti-Federalist critiques of the Constitution, differently than the Federalists, were much more prioritized, much more the interests of what were called at the time sort of common man, meaning that they tended to prioritize the interests of lower middle class white men, but especially tended to prioritize the interests of men living outside of urban areas, especially in the southern states and living in the western frontier areas, who primarily made their livings from agriculture. So unlike the Federalists, whose base tended to be in and around urban areas, and tended to draw their support from financiers, merchants, the Democratic Republicans had an opposite constituency, social and economic constituency, tended to draw their support from people living in rural agricultural areas to the west, to the south. And when I say to the west, I mean not just the Southwest, but the western frontier areas across North America. So you see, for example, strong Democratic Republican voting patterns in places like western Pennsylvania, far away from Philadelphia. You see them in western upstate New York, just to name 2 examples. And the spearhead, or the figurehead, I should say, of the Democratic Republican Party was Thomas Jefferson, who runs throughout this chapter and indeed runs throughout the history of the early republic, the years of the 1790s. Famously, of course, wrote the Declaration of Independence, was a major figure in the movement for independence, as a diplomat, was a slaveholder, and a very elite one at that. So that tells us one thing. It tells us that not all elites were drawn to the Federalists. Many, in particular, slaveholding elites, over time, gravitated to the Democratic Republican Party. Why? Because the core sort of belief of the Democratic Republican Party was a fear, even a hostility towards centralized power in a national government. Exactly what the Federalists trumpeted, exactly what was provided for in the Constitution. So you might be able to already sort of see some patterns emerging that continue to exist today, even though the parties we have are very different, and the society we live in is very different than that of the 1790s. A core difference between the two was a fear or a support for a powerful national government, the Federalists, and a fear of a powerful national government, the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists argued, and with some reason, to be clear, that the center of political sovereignty, meaning center of political power, should be concentrated in the individual states. Right? That way, the liberties of American citizens could be more powerfully safeguarded. Maybe that's the best way I'll put it. And these are, again, patterns that continue to exist today, right? Differences between today's political parties. And in many ways, this is a defining feature of the conflict between the two. It's called the conflict over federalism, right? Which layer of government, the national government or the individual state governments, should retain sovereignty over the other, which should be more powerful, to put it simply. And these are, this is a basic conflict that runs throughout American history, and it touched on the most important debates of the 1790s, the most important policy debates, I should say. And so I'll talk about two of them now, and then we'll wrap up this video. The first, economic policy. Second, foreign relations. There we go. And there are more, as I mentioned just a little bit ago, there's more to this than just economic policy and foreign relations, but these are the two that I'll talk about. So if you have the book open, I'll be reading a couple of quotes from it. And in particular, I'll be reading about economic policy, if you want to open this up, from pages 401 to 403 first. And this is a relatively short section of the book, but I think it's very important to emphasize the impact of partisanship upon the impact of economic policy upon the growth of partisanship. And here the two key figures are two people I've mentioned repeatedly already, are Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. So as I mentioned both 2 weeks ago in the talk about the Constitution, but also in earlier talks and readings about the so-called critical period, week 11 and week 12. The major reason for the downfall of the Articles of Confederation, indeed, to many historians, including myself, the biggest danger to the early United States, the years immediately after the end of the War for Independence, was a failing economy. And this, as I mentioned, was in many ways the primary reason why the Constitution was created to begin with, why the Constitutional Convention was convened in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. Delegates, elite white men, just to be clear, coming together seeking to find a way to reconstitute a government that would have the power to help revive or to save the American economy. And this is where Alexander Hamilton stepped in during the Constitutional Convention, and certainly where Alexander Hamilton had a tremendous amount of influence in the very first Congress, which began meeting in 1789 in New York City at a building called Federal Hall, which there is still a Federal Hall today, by the way. It's not the same building, it was rebuilt, but it's more or less on the same site. It's on Wall Street, if you're on Wall Street. There's a big, gigantic statue of George Washington in front of it. You can go see it today. It's next to a Trump building, actually. Enough about that. So, Alexander Hamilton was chosen by the first president, George Washington, in effect to take charge of financial affairs during the first Congress as the Secretary of Treasury. So Hamilton was named Secretary of Treasury and given arguably the most important responsibility of any individual in the first United States government after the Constitution was ratified, which is to come up with a financial plan to save the country. And because Alexander Hamilton was a leader of the Federalist faction, and I might have mentioned this earlier, but the word party, as in political party, wasn't used the way that it's used today. People refer to what we call political parties as factions. So the leader of the Federalist faction, or one of them, Alexander Hamilton, was the chief proponent of the idea that I mentioned earlier, that the United States national government should orient the nation's economy or pattern it after that of Great Britain's. So what did Great Britain's imperial government do to promote economic growth throughout the empire? Chiefly two things, and they're two things that Alexander Hamilton strongly promoted, that's the word, during his time as Secretary of Treasury. One, to create, and this is something the British Empire had already done, create and maintain a central banking system, something that did not exist under the Articles of Confederation at all. To use that banking system, centralized nationwide banking system, to promote local, state, and international trade, something that the national government under the Articles of Confederation was prohibited from doing. And three, and this isn't mentioned in Alan Taylor's chapter, but I think it's very important. It's only mentioned just in passing. Alexander Hamilton wanted the United States government, as the British imperial government had done, to promote manufacturing in the United States. So it's these three things: create a centralized banking system, use that banking system to promote local, state, and international trade, use national government power to promote manufacturing are the three main points of Hamilton's financial plan. All three of these things were premised on the idea of having a powerful interventionist national government. So that idea alone was frightening to his political opponents, especially Thomas Jefferson and other people who would come together to create the Democratic Republican faction or party. So I'll talk more about those in a second, but I do want to mention the other sort of key part of Alexander Hamilton's financial plans for the United States, and this is discussed on page 401 in some detail of Alan Taylor's book. And that had to do with what to do about both so-called national debt, but debt accrued by the Continental Congress while fighting the American War for Independence, as well as debts taken out by individual states to do the same. So another way of saying that simply is what to do about war debt, or the debt that the Continental Congress and the individual states had taken out from domestic and foreign bankers, individuals, in order to beat Great Britain. As Alan Taylor says, that debt combined $76 million, $51 million by the Continental Congress, $25 million collected by the individual states. Of the latter number, 25 million, the majority of that was debt taken out by the New England states, Massachusetts in particular, but also Connecticut, excuse me, in addition to New York and Pennsylvania. Another way of saying that is that northern states had taken out the vast majority of that debt. So Hamilton's proposal was to create a combined national and state debt, as is discussed on page 401, that would be the responsibility of a national banking system to administer. And his thinking, and this is also again discussed on page 401, and I'll read from this. Hamilton's plan was to, quote, to establish national credit, make the United States nation creditworthy, Hamilton meant to fund at its full face value the inflated war debt of the Congress, and to paraphrase, and more boldly still, that of the states, a combined 76 million. Now here's the key point of his plan, and this is what really angered his opponents, people who would soon to become Democratic Republicans. Rather than pay the debt down to nothing, rather than just pay off the debt, Hamilton meant to finance a permanent national debt whose annual interest payments of $5 million would interest public creditors in supporting the nation, for he considered a funded debt to be a national blessing. Federal customs duties, excise taxes, and Western land sales would generate the revenue to pay that interest in the government's annual operations. Okay, so let's translate that. What does that mean? Well, in effect, what it meant was that Alexander Hamilton recognized two things. One, the United States needed creditworthiness, and two, that when he surveyed the creditors of the United States, individuals who had loaned it money, who were themselves United States citizens, he realized that the vast majority of them were members of the economic elite, and Alexander Hamilton's idea was that the United States would fail as an independent nation unless the wealthiest classes in society were committed to the country. So instead of paying down the debt immediately, he proposed to create this massive combined Continental Congress and state debt and pay $5 million per year in perpetuity to all of the country's creditors. What this would do is force wealthy elites to whom the national government owed money to maintain their allegiance. They wanted to continue to get their $5 million in annual interest payments. But financially, it also would benefit them over the long run. They stood to make more money over the course of 20 to 30 years by taking $5 million in the year annual interest payments rather than receiving their lump sum debt payment at once. So, in short, what Alexander Hamilton proposed to do with his debt was to create a system that would benefit financial elites in the Northeast. And he was very clear about this. It was not something that Alexander Hamilton did secretly or tried to disguise. He said this country is going to fail unless Northeastern economic elites are invested in it. And if they're not invested in the country, then it will fail. It'll fall apart. This was the idea behind creating the Bank of the United States, his major proposal, the first national bank in United States history. This would be a bank that would primarily exist to administer this national debt, and in addition to that, to promote the trade interests and the financial interests of the economic elites who are also benefited by his debt policy. So, in effect, Alexander Hamilton's financial plan was directly oriented towards the interests of wealthy Northeastern people, who happened to be the main constituency of the Federalist Party. So when we look at his financial plan, it's very clear that it was discriminatory in that it benefited one particular group of people and did not benefit Southern and Western lower and middle class farmers who became the constituency of the Democratic Republican Party. So Hamilton's financial plan itself was one of the main reasons for the growth of the Democratic Republican Party. To many, again, from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, when they heard about Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury's financial plan, they became fearful that the direction the nation was taking was one in which a small number, we could call it an oligarchy, would be privileged over the interests of the people, again, meaning non-elite white men. And for his own reasons, Thomas Jefferson became the figurehead for this party, this growing Democratic Republican Party. His own reasons were, chief among them, his fear of a powerful national government, which of course is Hamilton's goal in creating the financial structure of the United States. He also just personally did not like Hamilton. Very few people did, actually. So this financial plan, again, really stimulated this growth of partisanship. And this intensified over the course of the 1790s. And as I mentioned, it touched on many other issues besides financial policy. But now I want to transition and talk about the second main issue that I want to discuss today, which is that of foreign relations. How did foreign affairs promote the growth of conflict between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans? And the portions of Alan Taylor's book that I'm referring to here are pages 415 to 423. Okay, so a little bit later in the chapter. And the starting point for understanding how foreign affairs influenced the rise of intense partisanship, factionalism, is the French Revolution. The French Revolution, if I'm sure many of you, or most of you are familiar with it, a sort of world-altering event similar to the American Revolution and its long-term impact, is very complex, and I don't have the time to go into it in much detail, nor does Alan Taylor. But suffice it to say that beginning in 1787, a protest movement in France against a very powerful monarch and a very, very powerful legal aristocracy that began to bubble up. By the early 1790s, in 1792 and 1793, for many reasons that I just don't have time to go into, the French Revolution became a radicalized, became a social and economic revolution in the truest sense, with the rise of political radicals called themselves Jacobins. Perhaps you've heard that term before. And with the rise of the Jacobins, by the way, Thomas Paine was one of their inspirations. Thomas Paine actually lived in France and participated in the early stages of the French Revolution. With the rise of the Jacobins, with the radicalization of the French Revolution, we see it become a democratic revolution and, as I said, a true social and economic revolution. The Jacobin movement inspired lower class French people, French men and women. Actually, women had a much more direct and full participation in the French Revolution than they did even the American Revolution. We see an upsurge of lower and middle class political activism that ultimately led to the abolition of the French monarchy, destruction of the legal system of aristocracy, the overthrow of the monarchy itself, ultimately the execution of the King and Queen of France. You probably heard of the Queen before, Marie Antoinette. So the radicalization of the French Revolution, in a very interesting set of dynamics, actually influenced quite significantly the growth of partisanship in the United States, because the two parties had very different views about the progress of the French Revolution by the early and mid-1790s. As Alan Taylor says, in the early stages of the French Revolution, before it became radical, in the 1790s, in the late 1780s, most American political leaders on both sides, in general, supported the idea of the French Revolution because it was seen as being a logical extension of the American Revolution. That's true of people who are Federalists and people who would soon to become Democratic Republicans. However, with its radicalization, what we see are Federalists, and here I'll give you a quote from page 415, began to, quote, reject the earlier linkage between the two revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, as Federalists recast the American Revolution as supposedly decorous, orderly, dignified, and solemn, and therefore, still quoting, as a complete contrast to the chaotic French version. Federalists, still quoting, began celebrating Britain as the champion of rational liberty, a reassuring bastion of stable government, and the source of profitable commerce. Another way of stating that is the Federalists by 1792 and 1793 rejected the radical democratic French Revolution and began to support Great Britain's attempts to invade France to put down the French Revolution, attempts that began in 1793. Meanwhile, Democratic Republicans were inspired by the democratic radical impulses of the French Revolution beginning in 1792 and 1793. Because Democratic Republicans, as I mentioned, took as one of their main inspirations opposition to the elitism of the Federalist Party. They viewed the clear anti-elitism of the Jacobin factions of the radical French Revolution favorably. And I'll read a quote from page 416. And this very much encapsulates the way that Democratic Republicans, including Thomas Jefferson, viewed the French Revolution. This is a paragraph beginning with "despite" on page 416. It says, "Despite the violent turn of the new revolution, 1792 and 1793, the reign of terror that was prosecuted by the Jacobins." You're probably familiar with the Jacobin use of the guillotine to chop their opponents' heads off. Despite the violent turn to the new revolutions, Republicans still praised France as a sister republic imperiled by the kings of Europe. Jefferson accepted the executions of monarchs and aristocrats as the worthy price of revolution. And here he gives a quote from Jefferson. "The liberty of the whole earth was depending on the issue of the contest, the French Revolution. And rather than it should have failed, I should have seen half the earth desolated. Were there but an Adam and an Eve left in every country and left free, it would be better than as it is now." Meaning Jefferson wholeheartedly supported even the radicalized version of the French Revolution. Back to Alan Taylor. Jefferson worried that if the French Revolution failed, reactionaries would triumph in America and convert the government, quote, "to that kind of halfway house, the English Constitution." So this is where we clearly can see foreign affairs begin to directly impact the partisanship of the 1790s. What this led to was, by the end of the 1790s, intense debates between Federalists and Democratic Republicans over issues like immigration policy. Federalists under second President John Adams attempted to prevent radical immigrants from coming to the United States because they feared they would become voters of the Democratic Republican Party. This was the Alien Act, passed in 1798. The Federalist administration of John Adams, also in 1798, passed a law called the Sedition Act, which was designed to allow the president to harshly suppress dissent, criticism of the American government, criticism that was largely leveled by recent immigrants and American citizens who voted for the Democratic Republican Party. We begin to see, leading up to the election of 1800, another event impact this political dynamic, the Haitian Revolution, a revolution which began in 1791 as an outgrowth of the French Revolution. Haiti had formerly been a French colony called Saint-Domingue. Enslaved people of primarily African descent began to rise up against the horrifyingly harsh regime of slavery in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, began to stir up in Haiti fears of a true slave revolution, which ultimately happened, ending in 1803. But the fears of the Haitian Revolution continued to worry Federalists, who feared that a democratic, radical upsurge throughout the Atlantic world would continue to infect the United States. So that by 1800, we have truly two parties that horrified each other, in that Federalists were horrified by the democratic at least for white men, impulses of the Democratic Republican Party, whereas Democratic Republicans were themselves horrified by the reactionary elitism of the Federalists, setting the stage for the first competitive election in American history, the election of 1800, which Thomas Jefferson won, but barely. And so that's where I'll stop today, and I'll pick up with some other topics relating to the 1790s about social change. We'll talk about the experience of women next week. So again, as a reminder of what I mentioned at the outset and then mentioned in emails, but just to clarify, last week I determined that I am canceling our final paper, and I am offering A's to all of you who responded to my emails from last week and continue for this week and next week to complete the discussion board responses. And again, I think that's only fair given that we all have significant, if not physical, then emotional and psychological stress. And I just want us all to take care of ourselves and not worry about ultimately meaningless 5-page papers. So as long as you've been completing work and you are continuing to complete discussion board responses through the end of the semester, you can expect an A in this class, but I do want us to stay engaged for the last 2 weeks, okay? And then we'll be, this very odd and weird semester will be finished. So again, I talked today about the topic for last week, parties in the age of revolutions. Next week, I'm going to talk about what was originally supposed to be the topic for this week, which is the early republic, women and legacies. So I do want you to read the 3 primary sources that I have on our syllabus relating to women in this period. First, Benjamin Rush's Thoughts on Female Education. Second, Abigail Adams's famous letter that is usually referred to as the Remember the Ladies letter to her husband, John Adams. And finally, to a selection from a writing by Judith Sargent Murray called On the Equality of the Sexes. Also, I'm asking us to read the last chapter of Alan Taylor's book called Legacies. And so the purpose of next week's lecture is, again, to talk about women and the experience of women, but to sort of just wrap up the semester. And so last week will be our last week. Okay, so I will post a discussion response on Wednesday, and you'll have through the weekend to complete it. If you have any questions, email me. And be safe, and I will see you in video next week.